Hi, is it okay if I go to the bathroom really quickly?
Hi, yes, you're the first competitor in here, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
As the debaters are arriving, we'll just start the round with a few announcements before we begin, but we can wait a few more minutes. I think we're still waiting on one more team.
Hi. It looks like both of the opponents are here, and I think I see all the judges.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. So a couple announcements before we begin. First of all, congratulations to our competitors for making it to finals of Parley at the state tournament. Congratulations.
Excuse me, one of the competitors said she had to go to the bathroom.
Okay, so we will wait 1 second. Oh, perfect.
I only see three students in here. Oh, there we go, that's one.
Okay, and let's see here. We've got both teams here. So we have team 1409 on the affirmative or the gov side, Young and Chatwin. And on the opposition negative side, we have Balor and Parikh. Is that correct? And their team and negative teams code is 1442. And we've got all of our judges here. So we have Judge Geronimo, Judge Norris, Judge Raffleson, Judge Stowitz, and Judge Sun. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm sure this will be a really great round. Again, it looks like we've got 1409 on the affirmative and 1442 on the negative. Could one of the students please put the topic in the chat for our judges? Okay, so the topic for this round is voting cannot be decolonized. All right, so for this round, we'll have the debaters go ahead and start. And after this round, the judges are going to submit the results for this round. Please don't disclose any of the results. The results will be announced at the awards ceremony later this evening. Okay, so after this round, you can go ahead and just fill out your ballots, and then we will announce the results at awards. Any questions before we begin?
I have a question.
Yes.
Since this is live streaming on YouTube and it is the last round of our careers, are we allowed to do a little shout out to just thank some people before we start our speech officially?
I think that would be fine. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, perfect. I was also planning on doing something a little short. So before I get started, I'd like to give a quick thank you to my partner, Kira, our teammates, our coaches, as well as our parents for supporting us throughout this whole event and throughout our debate career so far, as well as thank you to all the judges and the tab staff for sticking with us through such a long tournament. But I'll just keep it short and get straight into my speech. So we will be reading 3 sheets on the affirmation. And with that, is anyone not ready? All right, my time with 7 minutes on the clock starts now. I strongly affirm the resolution that voting cannot be decolonized. To provide some quick definitions, we want to define voting as the act of electing a representative individual into a government or other position of authority, and the definition of decolonizing is the undoing of colonialism, and colonialism is basically the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination of territories. So this is all, of course, in the context of Indigenous people being given voting rights in the countries who colonized them, which is why we have more specific definitions. To provide a quick bit of background, the Prime Minister John Diefenbaker pushed the voting rights legislation through Parliament, and it came into effect of July 1st that year in Canada. First Nations people were given a conditional right to vote status at the time of the Confederation in 1867, and to do so, they had to give up their treaty rights and Indian status. So this is just kind of an example of where people used voting as a reason to get Native Americans to give up their status and their treaty rights. So let's get straight into our first contention, which is going to be that voting is inherently colonial because it forces Indigenous people to participate in colonial bodies of power. We see that the Native vote has a history of colonialism, as shown by our first piece of background. The entire process that arrived at the Native vote was an imposition of US political identity on Indigenous peoples. In an 1823 Doctrine of Discovery ruling that was written into US law, Indigenous peoples did not have any rights as independent nations, but only as residents of the United States. And the only way that Native people even got the right to vote in the first place was through assimilation and destruction of their own government. For example, the Dawes Act of 1887 was passed to help spur assimilation. It provided for the dissolution of Native American tribes as legal entities and the distribution of tribal lands among individual members. So using these governmental rights to take apart these tribes and instead assimilating them into the government where voting occurs. We also see that voting forces these Indigenous people to elect people into colonial governments. For example, the United States federal government is a colonial body. It utilizes the police and military, which were and still are used as a method of force to maintain the state's legitimacy. For example, the creation of the police force was decolonial. It was centered on the preservation of the slavery system, for example, like chasing down runaways and preventing slave revolts. Thus, the police itself is just not decolonial. So putting these, or I'll get more into the explanation later. And for additionally, the existence of imperial borders using the United States federal government, and nation states only divide our common humanity, fracturing Indigenous peoples among different settler nations and manifesting settler sovereignty. And for example, in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the 1853 Gadsden Purchase, traditional homelands of 36 federally recognized tribes were split in two, splitting their homelands across Mexico and the United States so that they have to pass through rigorous security checkpoints in order to visit family or just participate in religious events. So I know I used a lot of big words, but essentially affirming the existence of a federal government, the US federal government, for example, through voting is going to promote the existence of these imperial borders that are only dividing and fracturing Indigenous communities. We also see that forcing Indigenous people to be subsumed into colonial bodies through voting takes away all of their sovereignty or their freedom to be their own nation. Sovereignty is the only method of decolonization to empower these Indigenous people to erode coloniality. You have to return power to the Indigenous people, and that is the only possible when they receive their own sovereignty, not when they have to vote other people into colonial governments. Our second contention is going to be that people are not granted access to anything through voting because political systems always exclude marginalized people, especially Indigenous people. We see that the political system has always and will always favor the well-off. Millionaires make up less than 3% of the general public, but have majority control of all three branches of the federal government. Working class Americans are 50% of the country, but have never held more than 2% of any seats in Congress. So something that uses voting as a method to put people in power. This means yes, what's your question?
Is voting exclusive to the sovereign state, or can it also be used as a tool for independence?
We would say that voting is exclusive to the sovereign state. Again, we have to give the people their power in order for them to be empowered, not giving power to a singular colonial individual. But anyways, continuing on, this means that marginalized populations, groups that don't have access to resources, such as Indigenous peoples, who are cut off from COVID aid, are going to constantly be excluded. Indigenous people have also faced difficulties getting to just the ballot box due to voter suppression. According to a report published by the Native American Rights Fund, factors like geographic isolation, voter identification requirements, and non-traditional mailing addresses all make very huge hardships when many Native Americans attempt to vote. Additionally, there are things like technological ideological barriers and depressed socioeconomic conditions that can exacerbate these problems or present new ones. And these conditions are inevitable in a governmental body that is always hostile to Indigenous people. So again, keeping these Indigenous people isolated and cutting them off from resources prevents them from voting and putting people that they want in power. And even today, exclusion is evident in policies being passed. Again, they had to request and then sue the federal government for COVID aid because the federal government did not provide aid to Indigenous people as it had stated. The third contention here is going to be that voting is used as a weapon of colonization, and therefore it cannot be decolonial. Voting rights are only granted to eligible individuals. So for example, it prevents youth from participating. And also we see this issue of felon disenfranchisement, where often felons cannot vote. And this means that prisons are able to be used as a system of colonialism due to voting. For example, looking to the higher incarceration rates of people of color, it makes it harder for them to vote in the future and empower themselves. And specifically in 2018, North Dakota passed a law requiring addresses in a government database to match the one on their voting ID cards. However, many ID cards of Indigenous individuals do not match the same as the government database because there were changes in the database that excluded Indigenous reservations. And as a result, just one office of many throughout North Dakota actually had to reject 40 absentee ballots from Indigenous populations due to their mismatched addresses, which means they were just, again, excluded from voting, and this prevented them from putting people that they wanted in power. So by using voting rights and granting them only to eligible individuals that are typically like the colonial settler versus the Indigenous or marginalized population, where they're able to use it as a weapon of colonization and keeping colonizers in power. We also see that excluding certain groups from voting using voter suppression and voter rights, as mentioned above, and was and is used to continue putting oppressive and colonialist individuals into places of power. For example, we can see Georgia voter suppression, where they're trying to pass a policy that is going to prevent people from sending like food and water to those waiting in long voting lines to disincentivize voting. So people are trying to prevent people from voting and putting decolonial people in positions of power through voter suppression. So overall, just to kind of sum it up, what we're seeing is that voting, it cannot be decolonized because it is inherently colonial. It is used to exclude people from the voting, or it is used to exclude people from putting people who they want in power, and is even used as a weapon of colonization. And for all of these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
Okay, so just for quick thank yous. Hi everyone, just a quick note. It's the first time we've been to state and the first time we've also gotten to a final round, so it feels appropriate to say thanks. Thank you, Mr. Woodhead, for always supporting and believing in us. Thank you to our friends for the same, you know who you are. Thank you to John Telebrico for being the person we can go to for anything related to debate and anything related to life. Thank you, Mr. Mills. We miss you so much. There's no way we would be here without you. And thank you to my partner. We've been through so much together, and I'm so lucky to have experienced it all with you. Okay, my time starts now. My partner and I strongly negate the resolution, voting cannot be decolonized. This is a fact round, and we would like to propose the weighing mechanism of preponderance of evidence, and essentially whichever team does the best job convincing you whether this is a fact or not should get your ballot. On to our first observation, voting is not necessarily about the process of getting someone implemented within a political state. It's also about passing policy initiatives, and that's going to be important later on in my speech. We would also like to propose a different definition of decolonization, which is the undoing of colonization, the latter being the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination of foreign territories. Essentially, colonization, as we will be explaining it throughout this speech and then throughout the rest of this debate, is first, the process of forcefully inhibiting the participation of Indigenous peoples or oppressed peoples from participation within their state of government, and second, the process of subjugating an entire oppressed group of people to a state without power or autonomy. And we would like to argue that that process is being actively reversed in the status quo. The second observation here is that decolonization, as the affirmative team would like to say, is not an end result that exists already within the status quo, but a constant process. The fact that reform has happened proves that decolonization can constantly occur within the voting process. This leads us to my first contention. The overturning of voter suppression is an act of decolonization. Subpoint A is that voter suppression is an act of colonization. The act of voting in colonial times was something that was denied to everyone who was not a powerful, wealthy white man, because colonization had reinforced that system and hierarchy of power, disguised it within landowner conditions and other qualifications to just reinforce the qualifications that a certain group of people people had an innate authority to control the political state and system. However, history proves that these conditions did not exist forever. Through radical movements throughout our centuries of existence, we have actively reversed the process of voter suppression and stripped absolute power away from the colonizer and into the hands of the people. Subpoint B is that there are historical examples to prove that. The very most significant one as the Voting Rights Act. It is one of the most important examples of how voting can actually be decolonized based on the very fact that it ensured the right to vote was not denied on account of race or color. It was something that took away the required elements of literacy tests, for example, that often inhibited Black people from voting, or property requirements that limited other minority groups as well. The fact that this came into place means that it stripped absolute control of the political system away from the colonizers and is representation of decolonization in process. Subpoint C is that we also actively have modern solutions that focus on the more innate parts of colonization. One example of colonization right now is within gerrymandering, where once a decade, every state redraws its electoral districts, determining which people will be represented by each politician. In many states, this means that politicians gather behind computer screens to figure out how they can manipulate the lines to box out their competition and maximize the power of their political party. Often these lines are drawn on race to dilute the impacts of racially homogenous communities that are most often minorities. However, there are bills currently being passed that actively combat that effort. For example, last year, Missouri voters approved a ballot measure that tasks a nonpartisan state demographer with redistricting. Similarly, last fall, Michigan's voters passed a constitutional amendment creating an independent redistricting commission. These are both initiatives that show you that people are taking action to actively reverse the effects of colonization. On a national scale, things like the For the People Act and activists working to overturn the impact of Supreme Court case Citizens United are focusing on initiatives that actively decolonize the process of voting. The For the People Act is plausibly the most important legislation because it radically changes the basic structure of US politics and has already passed in the House. The bill makes illegal essentially all of the enfranchisement tactics perfected by the right over the past decades and creates a new infrastructure to permanently bolster the influence of regular people and makes it far easier to vote both by eliminating barriers and enhancing basic outreach to citizens. It makes everyone's vote count more equally, especially by reducing gerrymandering. And third, it hugely amplifies the power of small political donors, allowing them to match and possibly swamp the power of big money. These are initiatives that reverse the process of colonization. And subpoint D is that the argument that there is nothing tangible we can do to reverse the colonized voting process is something that theoretically sounds true, but in practice strips minorities, indigenous peoples even more of pragmatic initiatives that can tangibly better their lives. While we can sit here discussing whether voting cannot be decolonized, minorities and indigenous peoples every day are having their rights stripped from them and not being able to vote. And to say that we can't do anything to reverse that process is frankly shallow and inhibitive. But contention too is that representation in politics proves otherwise. First, Deb Haaland is the first Native American Secretary of the Interior. This is key because indigenous peoples have largely been the ones whose land has been stripped away throughout US history. Their genocide and loss of land has been fatal to their culture. And because they weren't given power, their land was encroached on as it is today within like the Dakota Pipeline and other incidents. But now Deb Haaland is in power and she was voted into power. Giving an indigenous person control of the United States land is an active act of decolonization. Contention 3 is about independence referendums. Subpoint A is that negotiations for the terms of an independence referendum take place between nationalists and the government which exercises sovereignty over the territory. Independence referendums can be held without the consent of national or federal governments. Subpoint B is that independence referendums and voting have been used as active tools of decolonization, and here are 3 examples. First, Chile declared independence in 1818 and used its referendum as a jumping point to secure independence following the Chilean War of Independence. Chile was a country in South America that was actively colonized by Spain, having its indigenous community forcibly annihilated. But coalition building and the independence referendum in 1818 paved the way for Chilean independence, pushing the sovereign state of Spain out. This was effectively decolonization in practice. Second, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, Djibouti, Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Niger, and Senegal, and more all held independence referendums in 1958 to declare independence from France, and they worked. Third, independence referendums today continue to push back against oppression. After Western powers intervened in the Middle East, they drew borders how it economically benefited them and installed puppet regimes. These regimes in turn started oppressing ethnic minorities like the Kurds to maintain their power. But in 2017, Iraqi Kurds held an independence referendum and effectively broke away from the Iraqi state to form the region of Mosul. They were able to gain respect on an international stage and now operate autonomously. Okay, these are all examples of how decolonization works in action. Now on to the on-case arguments. On contention one, Daiki Alfred, a Mohawk political scientist, questions the modern day usage and practice of sovereignty that includes voting politics. According to Alfred, Native Americans should return to indigenous forms of sovereignty, including tribal consensus of opinion rather than Euro-American voting. The point here is that the process of voting has always existed, even before the Western state implemented their own version of it. To say otherwise is a delegitimization of the voting process that occurred within Native American tribes, within African tribes before they became colonized states. And when we talk about voting as a practice, we cannot delegitimize those other sources of voting as well that were not subject to colonization. Additionally, voting is not exclusive to the sovereign state, and it is a process. Just because there exist forms of voter suppression right now doesn't mean they aren't being actively targeted by policies and practices that indigenous people and minorities have the opportunity to participate in now. And that constant change and constant radicalization is decolonization in motion. For these reasons, I urge a strong negative ballot. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kira. I will be the second speaker for the affirmation in today's debate. I will first be going over our three contentions, reinforcing our points, and then going over the negations case. Okay. Is anybody not ready? No? 8 minutes. My time starts now. Let's go to our first contention, overview. You have to remember the process of decolonization is the undoing of colonialism. Colonialism being the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination of its territories, the territories that are not inherently its. Voting is inherently part of this system, but because it subsumes the sovereign territories of indigenous people into the colonial nation. It says that, yes, you are a part of this colonial system. You should participate in our colonial system. You are given this participation. They say that this participation is so good. They advocate for all of this participation, but they concede inherently that they do not want to participate in their colonial oppressors. They are their own sovereign nations. Indigenous people deserve to be their own sovereign nation. They deserve to have their own sovereignty. And assuming that people should just be given participation in the system that is inherently going to oppress them, in a system that has always historically oppressed them, in a system that has taken their land and is calling it their own, is just re-entrenching the system of colonialism that it was built upon. We see that historically, the vote has always only been given to strip these Native people of their power, of their territory. Just look to your Canada example. It tells you that people literally had to give up their rights and their Indian status in order to be able to be a part of this, in order to be able to participate in their government, in order to be able to be given these voting rights in the first place. Furthermore, we see the doctrine of discovery, that indigenous peoples don't have any rights as independent nations, but they do have rights to vote as US citizens. Voting is inherently a trade-off. Voting in colonial nations is inherently a trade-off. Either these indigenous people can either reject this government and be their own sovereign state, but voting forces them to become the sovereigns, to become the part of the colonial oppressor, to become and participate in their own oppression, to be a part of this body that has historically destroyed their people and destroyed their societies. On our affirmative case, they see that the modern day practice of sovereignty, we should use consensus of opinion, not Western method of voting. The thing is, indigenous people have always had their own method of coming to decisions. And at the point where they concede that voting in this circumstance is specifically electing representative officials into a government, that has never happened within Native societies. Usually, this has just been a part of they have their own sovereign methods of making their decision makings. It's been a Western method that has been imposed on them to vote in these colonial societies. They see that voting has always existed and that it delegitimizes their existence, but we're seeing that specifically this practice of electing white, male, rich people into positions of power just to oppress them more is clearly not going to be very effective at deconstructing colonialism. Then they see that there's voter suppression right now, but like they can fix this. But the thing is, it's not the point. The point is that voting in itself is stripping these Native people away from their sovereignty, stripping these Native people away from their own control over their own territory. It's saying, yes, this territory is part of the United States. It belongs to the United States. We are part of the United States, and that is inherently wrong. And then let's go on to our second contention, which is that people are not granted access to anything because political systems always exclude marginalized people. We see that Indigenous people have been excluded throughout history, and throughout a long, long historical period, millionaires have always made up the majority of the government, and marginalized people have never, and like working class Americans have never made up more than 2% of the seats in Congress. Despite all of these reforms, despite everything that's happened over hundreds of years, this has never changed. This is a system that is always going to be entrenched in, oh, the people with the most money, the people with the most capital, the people who do the best in society are always going to be the ones who do the best in like the political system and the ones who represent people. They try to advocate for, oh, there's one person who is an Indigenous person representing all Indigenous people in government. That is insufficient at the point where Indigenous people do not belong part of the US in the first place. And secondly, we see that the Indigenous people are always being excluded from the system in the first place because the practice of voting is always inherently exclusionary because the political system is ruled by people in the upper classes. Furthermore, on our third contention, we see that voting is actually used as a weapon of colonialization because voting rights are only granted to certain eligible individuals. We see that like passing laws that require the government database to match the exact one on the voting ID cards meant that tribal IDs were disqualified and these people couldn't vote. They say that we're making progress in some areas, and yes, maybe we are, but at the same time, we're taking steps backward in other areas. And that, like, inherently, this system is always going to be going back and forth. Oh, maybe voting is improving a little bit, but inherently, the system that it is placed upon is bad. It's rooted in the idea that this land, that this like sovereignty is not that of the Native tribes on their own, it's that of the US government. And that is inherently colonial because it is part of the US maintaining its own territories. Now let's go on to the negations case. Firstly, they see that voting is not just about the political state, it's about policy initiatives. But the thing is, policy initiatives are voted for by the people you elect through voting. That is inherently like what it's based upon. The people who decide the policy of the United States are the people that like people vote for, are the people who are elected by the people. That is the only way that like voting initiatives pass. It's entirely about the political state. It's entirely about who is elected because that is who makes our decisions for the entire world. We see that this top like 3% of millionaires, they are making all of the decisions. They have the majority in every single house, in every single Congress, in every single branch of government ever existing. That is problematic for multiple reasons. It inherently excludes people. It means that the political state, this upper class, gets to make decisions for people who like they inherently have no empathy with, they have no connection with. That is inherently colonial in itself. Overview to the rest of their arguments. None of these arguments understand that Indigenous people inherently do not receive sovereignty over their territory when they are voting. Voting is a method for the government to say, you get to participate in the governing of their land. But this is not the US's land. That says that this is the US's land, which is not. It is the land of the Indigenous people. It is their own sovereignty, and they should be able to have control of their own land. They shouldn't have to vote for white politicians to govern their land. They shouldn't have to vote for one Indigenous person to have control over a tiny sector of the government to hopefully be able to recover some part of their Indigenous land. It is their Indigenous land. And voting, saying that you should vote, saying that you should participate, means just tells them to relinquish their control, tells them that you should not have control over your land. You should just accept that this is the US's land, which it inherently is not. They see that there's a lot of overturning of voter suppression, but we see that overturning voter suppression is not voting. Despite all the reforms we're making, we have not decolonialized, and we are not decolonizing. Power still is in the hands of the state. These people are not receiving more power. In fact, we've just cut down the space of the reservations over time, which probably indicates that we are not making any progress towards decolonization. We're just making this worse. They say that we're trying to box out competition and that we can actively combat this with like policies, but the thing is, reform, they are advocating for reform, and reform is something that is inherently colonial. It's just not decolonization. Revolution and getting rid of the settler state and giving power back to the colonized is true decolonization, because the only way that the people actually get sovereignty, actually get control, actually get anything is if they have control over what is inherently theirs. Now let's go to their second argument, which is that about referendums. Firstly, a lot of this referendum stuff isn't even true. Like, the Kurds did not gain their power. A lot of this is just inherently false. Like, they are considered a semi-autonomous state controlled by the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi government literally shoots them every other day. That probably proves that this isn't very successful. Furthermore, we're seeing that like all of that just isn't even voting. None of that is voting. Those independence referendums are not voting. They're just a referendum that was held, a like bringing together of indigenous voices. And they are reclaiming their sovereignty. That is what we're advocating for. We're advocating for taking them out of the voting system, which is exactly the process of this independence referendums, what this did. And so because all of their examples probably just flow to the affirmation, and because we see that the only way to return sovereignty to these indigenous people is through eliminating their voting rights in the colonial bodies, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation in today's debate. Thank you.
Okay, solid. Let me really quickly do my thank yous. First of all, thank you to my parents for putting up with me through 4 years of debate. We're definitely bled over into our conversations at home. Thank you to our coach, Mark Woodhead, for being with us all like 4 years and helping us. Thank you to Mr. Mills. Thank you to John Telebrico for being with us in every single session and helping us for all our topics. You've literally been an instrumental force in defining like our debate careers, and we're forever indebted to you. Thank you to everyone who came before us: Aditi Chatradi, Ishan Gupta, Tanvi Bajaj, Arushi Lahiri, Odisha Palekar, Pranav Govindaju, Ismail Sheikh. Thank you to all my friends: Arnav, Caitlin, Rohan, Alex, another Rohan, Ines, Irina, Shafali, Viti, Kaylee, Ojis. Thank you for always being with us in our debate journeys, for being with us when we were down, when we were like high. Like, you've always been with us, and we're so appreciative. And finally, thank you to my partner, Kushi, for being a super competent debate partner and a slightly unhinged friend. Thank you to Inez for that description. But we've been through everything together, and if someone were to ask me if I would do it all over again, all the good parts, all the bad parts, I would do it all over again if it meant 4 more years learning with you. So, okay. All right, the order is going to be first on the framework, then we'll move on to their case, and finally we'll end on our case. All right, is everyone ready? Perfect. Judges, at the end of the day, the debate is going to come down to the framework, because in this area, we've already shown you why the negation automatically wins this debate. Let's first talk about this. First of all, let's talk about what decolonization actually means. We tell you that it's a process where you're reversing the process of colonization. That means that because reform has happened, and because voter suppression laws have been overturned and more people have been given voting rights, that automatically means that decolonization is happening in the status quo. It's not an end result, but something that is constantly occurring, which shows you again that in the resolution, voting cannot be decolonized. If reform has happened, then obviously it is being decolonized right now. Even then, our first observation here is that they tell you that like the only form of like voting is that you have to like vote for certain officials and stuff like that. Again, we ask you to consider our definition here, because it encompasses everything that's really relevant to the round. Because voting includes voting for independence, for example, voting for policy through like, for example, like propositions in different states, as well as like deciding what elected officials actually have power. This is the one that encompasses the most definitions, and it is also an active process of decolonization. The next thing they tell you on the framework is that voting is a part of a colonial system. Here's the problem here. I want you to really take note of the language that they use in this debate. They tell you that every form of voting that isn't Western voting is inherently not voting. Look to how they spoke about the Kurdistan example. They tell you that their independence referendum was not voting. However, Kurdistan has been recognized by Iraq and several different border states. That's how they've actually gained their independence and their autonomy. They now don't operate under the Iraqi government, and they have independent trade associations with countries like Turkey. This is really important because when they tell you that voting isn't valid until the colonial states like the United States deems it valid, they're feeding in to the colonial rhetoric that they themselves say is a bad idea. Clearly, voting can be decolonized, and it is happening right now. Even then, let's talk about this. They tell you that indigenous people should have their own sovereignty, and this remains the major contention of the entire debate. That's fine. Indigenous people should have their own sovereignty, but they can accomplish that through alternative forms of voting like independence referendums. We proved to you that independence referendums have been crucial in breaking away from the sovereign state and declaring their own entity and stopping that like structural violence. That means that if you only like view voting through a Western lens, then obviously it's colonial. But voting has been happening for like thousands of years in every single major civilization. Look at the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Mauryans, the Qing dynasty. Like voting has literally happened everywhere. To only like view it in the Western lens is inherently a violent idea that then justifies even more atrocities, because it was literally the idea that American voting systems were more valid than indigenous voting systems that justified colonization in the first place. That's why their rhetoric is super problematic. Lastly, on the framework, they tell you about Canada giving like imposing these like regulations over where you have to like give up your indigenous rights. Again, you have to look to a global context. The Western interpretation of voting may be like very bad, but voting as a whole in a global context with historical context can be decolonized and is currently happening through overturning voter suppression, as well as the fact that it's happening right now like through independence referendums. Now let's move on to their case. On their first contention, they essentially tell you that that just because voting has always existed, it doesn't mean that you're actually getting people into power. But again, listen to the rhetoric here. They say, again, indigenous communities have people in power. To say that they have never voted, again, is to justify more violence. Then they tell you that indigenous people can never get power in a colonial state. However, one, you can reject the state and say that it doesn't exist, but it will still engage you and it will still have power over you. To say that like indigenous people should never can never have power in the United States, and then say that like you should never engage with policy, means that nothing ever gets done to like actually stop the structural harms on Indian reservations. And for example, look to missing and murdered indigenous women. Look to the fact that there's no investment in education and infrastructure on these reservations. Without indigenous people in power, without voting to make sure that certain policy positions go into place, like that never happens. Clearly, voting is used as a tool of decolonization to redistribute wealth and invest back into native like communities. That clearly shows you that it's not the case that voting cannot be decolonized. Onto their second contention, they tell you that like Deb Haaland is insufficient. We absolutely agree, but it proves to you that decolonization is happening right now. All they prove to you is that more decolonization needs to happen. They, in order to win, must prove to you that decolonization has never happened and can never happen. They can't do that because they concede that reform is possible. Onto their third contention. The main argument that they give you here is that there's been this like back and forth on whether like the government has gotten better, because we've gotten better in some areas but gone back on others. But we have to look to like the overall trajectory. Look to how my partner proves to you that like for example, indigenous peoples like literally didn't have voting rights, and like Black people in the United States literally didn't have voting rights. But then voter suppression laws have been overturned through things like the Voting Rights Act. And like currently there are more bills in place that are going to make sure that there's more voting rights. Voting is a key agent to using the state to better the material conditions for people. And that means because it's a tool and has no assigned morality to it, it can be a tool of decolonization. Now let's move on to our case. On our first contention, they drop a lot of our warrants here. We talked to you how, for example, 1, independent redistricting commissions are now reversing gerrymandering, which was done on racial lines. 2, like there are acts like the For the People Act that is making disenfranchisement laws like illegal. They drop all these warrants that show you that reform is currently happening in the status quo. And that again proves them wrong in the fact that voting is being decolonized. If they tell you that voter suppression is happening right now, it just means that more decolonization needs to happen, but they don't prove the thesis of the resolution. Onto our, well, they also tell you that reform is not decolonization and that we need to be giving indigenous people their own sovereign state. That's fine. One, that can be solved through independence referendums. To say that independence referendums are not a valid form of voting is to again invalidate the rights of different minorities and different oppressed groups. And second, reform is good in the sense that it actively makes people's lives better. If we sit here stipulating about what is decolonization and what is not, that does nothing for actual native people on reservations. To say that you should reject the state and only then talk about decolonization doesn't do anything. Only structural policy actually solves. And on our third contention, this is the biggest voting point in the round because it goes completely drop. We give you three main examples. One, in Chile, how an independence referendum allowed them to build a coalition and then basically declare independence from Spain. That was followed by the Chilean War of Independence, which made sure that indigenous peoples were able to break away from the sovereign state. Second, we give you a bunch of African countries, Cameroon, Niger, etc., that broke away from France in 1958 by holding a independence referendums. Finally, we give you the clear example of Kurdistan, where their own independence referendum has given them a sovereign state where they're able to stop the oppression of their peoples that was happening by other state actors. They've gained independence and they've used it to stop colonial acts. Clearly, voting can be decolonized and should be decolonized. Further, vote next.
All right, I'm just going to start my timer. It's 4 minutes. It's probably just going to be voting issues. Okay. And my time starts now. At the end of this debate, my partner Nishida and I still strongly negate the resolution that voting cannot be decolonized. And under the weighing mechanism of preponderance of evidence, at the point where we are the only ones in this round telling you how specific countries and how specific indigenous and peoples and minorities had used the process of voting to actually eliminate the effects of colonization and voter suppression, you have to buy that we are the only ones showing you that the process of decolonization is possible. Realize that the entirety of the affirmative case boils down to two things. First, that decolonization hasn't been fully realized yet, so it can never occur. And second, that indigenous peoples being forced to participate in a process that recognizes the alleged legitimacy of US claim over land means that voting cannot be decolonized. First of all, these are two entirely broad generalizations that don't actually take into account the historical precedent that proves to you that first, reform is possible. That's going to be our first voting issue in this round. Reform has happened and is currently happening, and they concede this when the last speaker says that yes, some reform has happened. Word for word, as she says that, you have to buy the reform is possible, and their argument about decolonization as an end goal that hasn't been fully realized yet is terribly wrong. This means that decolonization is possible. We don't have to prove to you that the status quo represents the full extent of what decolonization can be, just that it is possible by the overturning of voter suppression laws that allow indigenous people and minorities who had been previously stripped of their power to actually have access to political control of the state. For example, when independent redistricting commissions are against the process of gerrymandering, they drop all of our arguments here about how eligibility requirements from hundreds of years ago were tangibly removed. Things like literacy tests, things like property requirements were the requirements and the qualifications of 100 years ago, and the removal meant more people had access to control of the voting process and control of the political system. Things like voter ID laws, sure, fine, may exist and may mean that decolonization hasn't fully happened yet, but still are requirements that can be tangibly removed in the same way the requirements 100 years ago were. And additionally, the second thing here is that different forms of voting were not always subjected to the process of colonization. When they tell you that voting is invalid because it always forces indigenous peoples to participate in systems that aren't theirs, it ignores the extensive history of voting without the lens of colonization. And when you realize that they're doing that, they actively perpetuate a notion of voting as inherently colonized when it didn't exist like that. Indigenous peoples should have sovereignty, and they can accomplish this through alternative forms of voting as well. Independence referendums, which is a manifestation of voting, allowed indigenous peoples to restore their sovereignty. Voting in a global context isn't always colonial and can, in fact, be used to remove the colonizers from the land in which people had been oppressed. And when we tell you that voting is a tool that doesn't always inherently legitimize the state or state control, but rather uses the state to materially improve the conditions that Indigenous and minority people are subjected to, realize that they concede that the act of voting can be one of decolonization as it brings more people into power. For example, it wasn't just one Secretary of the Interior, it was someone who had control over US land now, which operates as an act of decolonization. And when we tell you that literally Indigenous tribes right now participate in the voting process to materially benefit their own state of life, you can see that their broad generalizations about how this is an unfair colonization process don't actually make sense. Vote on the warrants of the examples that we provide. They concede a couple things. First, that voting has been key to independence referendums and they are a manifestation of voting. Second, that voting referendums have been key to declaring independence. And third, when states reclaim their sovereignty away from their oppressors, they actively reverse the process of colonization. They concede the definition of colonization as a process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination of foreign territories, and declaring independence and voting independence is the exact opposite of that. For these reasons, I urge a strong negative ballot. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and give the final speech for the affirmation. Quick reminder, my name is Maya Young. I will be just giving a short overview, talking about the aff, the neg, and then finishing off with just kind of summing it all up. Is anyone not ready? Okay, I have 5 minutes on the clock. My time starts now. Judges, this debate is not a question of whether or not voting is good, not even whether or not reform is good. It is a question of whether voting is inherently colonial or not, whether we can decolonize the electoral process whereby Native people elect representatives to the state. For my readers of Tuck and Yang, we cannot treat decolonization as a metaphor. We cannot allow for solely the resettlement of land for solely reform. We must fully invest in eradicating this structure that engages in Indigenous disappearance and cultural genocide. We see that reform of something that is inherently colonial, so the voting process, the United States federal government, this is not decolonization. It just re-entrenches an inherently colonial structure. Let's start by looking at the affirmation case. We tell you that voting cannot be decolonized for 3 key reasons. 1, voting always has and is telling Indigenous people to relinquish their control. Even if you make reforms, the fact of the matter is, as long as you vote to put people into power, you are forced to give up your sovereignty to this colonial body of power. And thus voting is forcing these Indigenous people to give up their power to these federal oppressive governments that have been their colonizers and still are their colonizers. Secondly, we see that voting is used as a way to exclude marginalized populations. Despite all the reforms we made, there's still voter suppression happening in 2021. Again, look to the policies of like Georgia voter suppression that, and thirdly, voting is a weapon of colonization. Again, even with the reforms we make, voting always forces Indigenous populations to relinquish their power and relinquish their sovereignty. Reform is not decolonization. It masks the problem and encourages Indigenous populations to be assimilated into the state. Do not let the negation convince you that reform is decolonization. We agree that it is a process, an ongoing process. It is a process of abolishing the settler state, not reforming within the state. So as long as voting exists, yes, I'm stopping time.
Sure. So the argument that voting masks the actual issue is a new articulation.
Decolonization is the complete abolition of the settler state.
Yeah, so those are new arguments that haven't been articulated before in the debate. As always, the negation team would love a chance to respond, but as this is the last speech, we would ask that the judges strike the floor.
I would say that it's just kind of an extension of the argument that the extension of kind of the entirety of your case that reform is colonial and that voting the voting process is inherently colonial, so anything we do is only not going to solve the issue, but of course it is up to the judges. But I guess I will just move on from that and continue where I was. I have 3 minutes left on the clock. My time resumes now. What we see is that as long as voting exists, it can and will be used as a weapon of colonization. Look at how people have to give up their rights, that Indigenous people had to give up their land just to get those voting rights. And once they got those voting rights, they are still being excluded and suppressed from the voting process. Now, on the other hand, the neg brings up some key issues. One, that we are ignoring non-Western voting processes, and two, that reform is decolonization. So let's start with the first argument. Specifically, they talk about this issue like Kurdistan and their independence referendum. But we bring up two key issues on this argument. One, that their examples are not fully accurate. For example, on the issue of the independence referendum, my partner tells you that these the Kurds are only semi-autonomous because they had to operate within the state, they had to use these voting processes, and they only could reform, which is, yes?
The argument that Kurdistan is under another sovereign state is one, untrue, but also has like never been articulated in the debate.
My partner definitely made the argument that they're only semi-autonomous in the MG or second affirmative speech, but again, up to the judges. All right, I will resume time now. And the second issue here is that we believe that the resolution only refers to Western colonial voting. As we said in the first speech, we want to contextualize this to because this resolution assumes that it is colonial right now. And we also told you at the top of the affirmative to look at the affirmative through the lens of the relationship between the indigenous people and their colonizers. We believe that this should be, again, contextualized specifically to the resolution about Western colonial voting, which means we shouldn't really be talking about the issue of the Kurds. Although this is an important issue, it is not contextualized to the revolution. We have to look at the relationship between the indigenous people and their colonizers. The second issue that they raise is that reform is decolonization. But again, we tell you that this is not true. The entirety of our case is that reform is inherently colonial, that voting is inherently colonial. You cannot decolonize something that is inherently colonial. Again, I answered this above, but if you want to remember one phrase, it should be revolution over reform. Granting sovereignty is decolonization, not reforming the voting process. They tell you themselves that Deb Haaland has control over United States land, but that it is not enough. Right in that statement, they are articulating that this land was never that land of indigenous people, which is inherently wrong and bad and ruins the chance of sovereignty. Furthermore, you should be extending the argument that as long as you operate and reform through the state, you are giving up your power to the state that is inherently colonial and is not and never will decolonialize unless we take action, unless we abolish the settler state. Furthermore, decolonization, as they want, is a flip-flopping process. Some laws improve in more progressive areas, like the reform they love so much, yet voter suppression, again, like in Georgia, like in the past, is still happening. So to sum it up in all a few sentences, we see that to sum it all up in a few sentences, we see that decolonization is not reform. Only by abolishing the settler state and the violent voting process it uses can we fully decolonize, and thus voting cannot be decolonized because it will always be a tool of the settler state. This should be an easy AF ballot because the entire negation case relies on two facts: that non-Western voting is bad, which we've already proved is not relevant to the resolution, or sorry, non-Western voting is good, which we proved is not relevant to the resolution, and also voting through these settler states still leads to only semi-autonomy, and secondly, that reform is decolonial, which again, we proved to you is just completely false. On the other hand, the affirmation proves to you that the resolution is about Western voting. We agreed, and secondly, that reform is actually a weapon of colonization. So Judge, because decolonization is only possible in a world where indigenous people aren't forced to give up their rights to vote, where they aren't excluded from electoral policies and aren't forced to only reform and cooperate with their oppressor, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
All right, good debate, y'all.
Good debate. Yeah, good round, everyone.
And thank you so much for judging.
Thank you, judges, and I guess we'll see you at 7.
Good debate, you all.
Let's all give a hand to our final round panelists. Congratulations, everyone. The debaters, congratulations to the seniors that we have here in this round. And congratulations to the affirmative team as well.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, and congrats, finalists.
Congrats.
Congratulations, guys.